The air was thick with dust, coating Jake's uniform in a fine layer of gray as he stepped over the shattered remains of what was once a home. The distant cries of sirens had long since faded, leaving only the crunch of debris beneath his boots. His muscles ached, his breaths were shallow, but he pushed forward. Somewhere beneath this destruction, there could still be life. He scanned the wreckage, his heart heavy. How many had they lost today? He didn't want to think about it. Not yet. Keep moving, keep searching. That was all he could do. Hours had passed. The once rushed pace of the rescue team had slowed to something resembling defeat. Nothing, no movement, no voices, just endless layers of collapsed walls and broken dreams. Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his exhausted face. His team exchanged glances, silent, unspoken admissions of doubt. Maybe this was it. Maybe there was no one left to save. He hated that thought. He hated the stillness, the way hope seemed to shrink with each passing second. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he turned away. Maybe it was time to call it. Then he heard it, faint, fragile. A whimper. Jake froze. His breath caught in his throat, ears straining against the eerie silence of the ruins. He turned sharply, scanning the debris-strewn ground, willing the sound to come again. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing. Maybe it had been his imagination, a trick played by exhaustion. But then, there it was again. A sound so weak it barely carried through the heavy air, but it was there. Something was alive. His heart slammed against his ribs as his pulse spiked. Did anyone else hear that? His voice was rough, urgent. He wasn't leaving now, not yet. Jake's eyes met the weary gaze of another rescuer, Noah, who nodded slowly. "Yeah," Noah murmured, stepping closer, his expression sharpening with determination. "I heard it too." A jolt of adrenaline coursed through Jake's veins. They weren't imagining it. He dropped to one knee, pressing his ear against the fractured concrete. Fingers splayed across the rubble. He could feel his own heartbeat thudding wildly, but beneath it, another sound. A shallow, uneven breath. Someone, or something, was trapped down there, and it was still alive. Jake surged to his feet. "We've got movement!" His voice cut through the weight of despair that had settled over the team. In an instant, the mood shifted, rescuer instincts kicking in. "We need to dig here, now!" The others sprang into action, calling for equipment, clearing debris by hand where they could. Time was against them. Every second counted. Jake's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled away the first slab of concrete. "Please, just hold on." He didn't know who or what was beneath the rubble. But one thing was certain, they weren't leaving without them. The whimper was faint, almost swallowed by the eerie silence of the ruins. But Jake heard it. "Over here!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and dust. His team turned, their boots crunching over shattered glass and unstable debris. Jake's pulse pounded as he scanned the wreckage, his flashlight beam flickering over the twisted remains of what had once been a home. The sound came again. A weak, desperate cry. "Keep moving," someone urged. They wove through the collapsed structure, hearts racing. Something, or someone, was still alive beneath the rubble, and they were running out of time. Jake dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against the unstable ground. The whimper was close. Too close. "Here, it's coming from under this beam." The team sprang into action. Dust filled the air as they pried apart heavy slabs of concrete. Every movement had to be calculated. One wrong step could send the entire pile caving in. Jake's hands ached, his muscles screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. The sound grew weaker. "Faster," he urged, adrenaline drowning out fatigue. Hope dangled by a thread, and if they hesitated even a second longer, it would snap. Then, beneath the wreckage, a shape emerged. The team froze. A gasp rippled through them. It wasn't a person, it was a dog, a German shepherd, pinned beneath a fallen beam, its body caked in dust and streaked with dried blood. The dog barely moved, just the shallow rise and fall of its chest, each breath a battle. Jake knelt beside it, his heart hammering. "He's alive," he murmured, disbelief mingling with relief. But barely. If they didn't act now, survival would slip through their fingers. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing against matted fur. The dog flinched, but didn't growl. Weakness had stolen its ability to fight, but its amber eyes, those remained sharp. They locked onto Jake's with a silent plea, raw, unspoken trust mixed with unbearable pain. He swallowed hard. "We've got you, buddy." The shepherd didn't move, but Jake saw it. The faintest flicker of understanding. The will to survive was still there. It just needed someone to fight for it. And Jake would. He moved slowly, mindful of the dog's injuries. His trembling fingers hovered over its fur before finally making contact. No resistance, no attempt to flee. Jake exhaled, his chest tight with emotion. In that moment, something shifted, an unspoken understanding between them. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. The dog barely blinked, exhaustion weighing heavy on its body, but Jake swore he felt it. A tiny, hesitant surrender. A trust, fragile yet undeniable, forming in the heart of the wreckage. As Jake carefully shifted the debris, something caught his eye. A collar. He wiped away the dust, revealing a single word, barely legible beneath the grime. Max. The name was simple, yet it carried the weight of a story untold. Someone had loved this dog once. Someone had called for him, waited for him. But now there was only silence. Jake swallowed. "You're Max," he said softly, and somehow it felt right. Jake's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a stray clinging to life. Max had belonged to someone. Had they made it out? Were they searching for him even now? Or was Max all that remained of a life lost in the rubble? Jake didn't know. But as Max lay there, his breath shallow, his eyes still locked onto Jake's, it didn't matter. Right now, he wasn't just a rescue worker. He was Max's only chance. No more hesitation. Jake slid his arms beneath Max, lifting him with a gentleness that defied the urgency in his steps. The dog let out a weak whimper but didn't fight him. "Let's move," Jake barked, breaking into a run. His team flanked him, clearing the path as they sprinted toward the emergency station. The world around them blurred. Dust, ruins, echoes of loss. But in Jake's arms, Max's heart still beat, faint, fragile, fighting. And Jake wasn't going to let it stop. Max lay curled on the thin blanket, his ribs faintly visible beneath his matted fur. His breathing was uneven, each rise and fall of his chest a quiet testament to the battle he had fought just to survive. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the room, but it wasn't enough to mask the faint metallic tang of old blood and dust still clinging to him. Jake stood in the doorway, hesitant. He had seen animals in rough shape before, but there was something about Max. Something in the way his body barely stirred. Yet his tail gave a slow, barely there thump against the floor. A sign of life, a sign of trust, however fragile. Jake exhaled, stepping forward. "You're a fighter, aren't you, buddy?" As Jake watched Max's feeble attempt at a wag, something inside him shifted. He had been here before, standing over another dog, watching its chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. A different time, a different place, but the same suffocating helplessness. He clenched his jaw, forcing the memory down. Losing Charlie had been the hardest thing he'd ever faced. He had sworn he wouldn't go through it again. But Max was different. He wasn't his, not really, just a survivor, a lost soul caught in the chaos of destruction. And yet, as their eyes met, deep amber locked onto uncertain hazel, Jake felt it. That familiar pull, the silent understanding between man and dog. The first few days were slow. Jake came every morning, sitting cross-legged by Max's cot, careful not to get too close. He spoke in low, steady tones, telling stories about nothing in particular, about the rescue missions, about the people he'd met, about the dog he once had and lost. Max listened. He never moved much, but his ears twitched at the sound of Jake's voice. Each day, Jake brought a small treat, setting it just a little closer than before. And every evening he left without forcing anything, waiting for Max to decide when he was ready. "He's been through hell," the vet said, arms crossed as she studied Max's charts. "Abandoned, injured, starved. He might never fully trust humans again." Jake absorbed the words, watching Max from across the room. He was still curled up, but he was watching Jake too. "I don't know," Jake murmured. "He's stronger than he looks." The vet sighed. "Just don't expect too much. Some scars don't heal." Jake's gaze never wavered from Max. The dog had been through the worst and survived. That alone told Jake that he wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. The first time Max moved toward him, it was barely noticeable. A hesitant inch forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Jake stayed still, heart hammering in his chest. He had spent days letting Max set the pace, never pushing too hard, never breaking the fragile line of trust between them. Then, one morning, it happened. Max hesitated, then pressed his nose against Jake's outstretched fingers. It was brief, barely more than a whisper of contact. But it was real. Jake let out a slow breath. "Good boy, Max." And for the first time, Max didn't flinch at the sound. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the room as Jake sat cross-legged, watching Max from a careful distance. He extended his hand, as he had done every day. Max stared at him, eyes uncertain. But then, with a quiet exhale, he shifted forward and licked Jake's fingers. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. It was nothing, a single, fleeting gesture. And yet, in that moment, it meant everything. "Yeah," Jake whispered, voice thick. "You're getting there, buddy." Max didn't pull away. Jake searched. He called shelters, posted flyers, combed through lost pet reports. Someone, somewhere, had to be missing this dog. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing. It was as if Max had been erased from the world before Jake found him beneath the rubble. No one was looking, no one was coming. And with each passing day, the question grew louder in Jake's mind. Was Max meant to be his? Jake leaned against the rescue center's wall, staring at Max, who was curled up on his cot. The dog still carried the weight of his past, but there was something different now. His eyes weren't just filled with fear. There was something else, something Jake wasn't ready to name. "Guess it's just you and me, huh?" Jake muttered. Max lifted his head slightly, as if he understood, as if he wanted to understand. And Jake realized maybe he wasn't ready to let go either. It was late. The rescue center was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the occasional creak of shifting walls. Jake had dozed off in the chair beside Max's cot, exhaustion pulling him under. A faint rustling stirred him awake. He blinked clearly, then froze. Max had moved, not much, just enough to close the space between them. And now, with a deep, tired sigh, he rested his head on Jake's lap. Jake didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, He reached down, fingers brushing against Max's fur. This time, Max didn't pull away. And in that quiet moment, something unspoken passed between them, something final. Jake had found Max, or maybe Max had found him. Jake exhaled slowly, staring at the adoption papers in front of him. His fingers traced the edges as he replayed the last few weeks in his mind. Max's slow journey from fear to trust, the way the dog had finally let his guard down. It wasn't even a question anymore. Max belonged with him. With a firm nod, Jake picked up the pen, ready to sign. But just as he touched the paper, a sharp knock on the rescue center's door shattered the quiet moment. He turned, surprised to see the shelter director's tense expression. "There's someone here," she said cautiously. "He claims Max is his dog." Jake's grip tightened on the pen. "What?" The director shifted uncomfortably. "He says Max belongs to him. He has pictures, old ones, but they look legitimate." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had just decided. Just convinced himself that Max was his. Now, in an instant, that certainty wavered. He forced himself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe it was true. Maybe Max had a home, a family. That should be good news, right? But as he walked toward the waiting area, a nagging unease settled deep in his chest. Something didn't feel right. The man waiting in the lobby had an uneasy energy about him. He stood stiffly, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes darting around the room rather than settling on Max. "I've been looking for him for weeks," the man said, forcing a smile. "Can't believe he ended up here." Jake studied him closely. Shouldn't he be relieved? Overjoyed? But the man's tone was flat, detached, like he was going through the motions. Max, who had been growing more confident every day, suddenly tensed. His ears flattened, his tail tucked between his legs. Jake's unease sharpened into suspicion. Max didn't move toward the man. He didn't show any recognition. No wagging tail or eager eyes. Only fear. Jake knelt beside him, resting a gentle hand on his back. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured. But Max's muscles remained rigid, his breathing shallow. The man cleared his throat. "He probably doesn't remember me. It's been a while." Jake's jaw tightened. That wasn't how it worked. Dogs remembered. They never forgot kindness or cruelty. A deep instinct stirred in Jake's gut, a warning that refused to be ignored. Something was wrong. And he was going to find out what. That night, Jake couldn't shake the feeling. He sat at his kitchen table, laptop open, digging through every pet-related report he could find. The man's name, the city's lost pet forums, rescue alerts, anything that might tell him who this guy really was. Then he found it. A small news article buried in an old archive. An animal cruelty case. The man's name listed. Charges dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the details were sickening. Malnourished dogs, untreated injuries. Jake's stomach twisted. Max hadn't been lost. He had escaped. And now, Jake had no doubt. He couldn't let Max go back. The next morning, Jake stormed into the rescue center, documents in hand. The shelter director's face hardened as she read through them, then turned to her staff. "We need to report this," she said firmly. Together, they confronted the man when he returned. Jake held up the printed article. "Care to explain this?" The man's expression flickered. Shock, then irritation. "That was years ago. It doesn't mean anything." Jake folded his arms. "It means everything." The rescue staff stood their ground, refusing to release Max. This wasn't just about adoption anymore. It was about justice. And Max wasn't going anywhere. The man's face darkened. "He's my dog," he spat, voice rising. "You can't keep him." Jake stepped forward, his pulse hammering. Max doesn't even recognize you. He's terrified of you. The man scoffed. He'll remember when he's home. Jake clenched his fists. Home? Or back in a cage? The shelter director held up her hand. We've already contacted the authorities. Panic flashed in the man's eyes. You have no right. Jake didn't flinch. No, you have no right. Max deserves better. Max let out a low growl, stepping closer to Jake. The message was clear. This was his home now. When the authorities arrived, the truth unraveled quickly. The man had no proof of recent ownership, and his past record sealed his fate. His claim was revoked. The shelter staff breathed a collective sigh of relief. The man, now furious, stormed out, muttering threats under his breath. But he was powerless. Max was officially safe. Jake looked down at the dog beside him, his heart still pounding. He reached out, running a hand through Max's fur. "You're not going anywhere, buddy," he whispered. For the first time, Max wagged his tail. That night, Jake sat on his couch, exhaustion finally catching up to him. The weight of the past few days pressed down on his chest. Had he really almost lost Max? A quiet sound pulled him from his thoughts, a soft shuffle of paws. Max limped over, his movements slow but deliberate. He stopped in front of Jake, then, without hesitation, placed his paw gently on Jake's arm. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. No words were needed. Max had chosen him. And Jake knew, without a doubt, he had chosen Max too. The phone call came just before sunset. Jake answered with a mix of nerves and hope, gripping the edge of his chair. "Congratulations," the voice on the other end said warmly. "Max is officially yours." A slow smile spread across Jake's face as he turned to Max, who lay by his feet, eyes half-lidded in contentment. "Did you hear that, buddy? You're home. For good." Max's ears perked up, and as if sensing the finality in Jake's words, he stood and pressed his head against Jake's chest. For the first time, there was no hesitation, no fear, just quiet acceptance. Their new life together had truly begun. Max's transformation was slow but undeniable. The scars of his past, both physical and emotional, began to fade. Each day, his coat looked healthier, his steps steadier, his tail wagging more freely. At night, he no longer sleeps curled in the tight, protective ball he had when Jake first brought him home. Instead, he sprawled comfortably on his bed, trusting that he was safe. One evening, as Jake sat beside him, scratching his ears, Max let out a deep sigh of contentment. For the first time since they'd met, his eyes held no fear, only trust. The wind rushed through Max's fur as he raced across the open field, his paws kicking up loose dirt. His tail, once limp with uncertainty, now wagged high and proud. Jake watched from a distance, his heart swelling. This was what Max deserved. Freedom, joy, a life without fear. Max skidded to a stop and turned back, panting with excitement. Then, in a burst of energy, he charged toward Jake, playfully knocking into him. Jake laughed as he stumbled back. All right, I get it," Jake chuckled, ruffling Max's fur. "You're happy?" Max licked his face in response. "Ready for your first real adventure?" Jake asked as he secured Max's harness. The dog wagged his tail, ears perked in excitement. They set off on a trail that wound through towering trees and rolling hills, the scent of damp earth filling the air. Max trotted ahead, his nose twitching at every new smell. As they climbed higher, Jake couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. A few months ago, Max was broken and wary. Now, he was leading the way, confident and eager. Jake smiled. "This is just the beginning, buddy." Max barked in agreement. Just as they reached a clearing, Max froze. His ears pricked, his body tense. Jake stopped mid-step. "Max, what is it?" The dog let out a low growl, his eyes locked on something beyond the trees. Then, without warning, he took off. "Max," Jake called, sprinting after him. His heart pounded as he rounded the bend. Then he saw it. A small child, no older than 6, clung desperately to the edge of a rocky ledge, his fingers barely gripping the dirt. Max stood just feet away, barking urgently. Jake's blood ran cold. Max inched closer to the boy, his tail still, his stance careful. He let out a short, sharp bark, an urgent call for Jake to act fast. Jake's mind raced. One wrong move, and the child could slip. "Hey, kiddo, stay calm," Jake said, lowering himself onto his stomach. "I'm coming to get you, okay?" The boy whimpered, his fingers trembling. Max barked again, stepping closer, as if reassuring him. Jake reached out, stretching as far as he could. "Grab my hand." The boy hesitated, then let go of the ledge, just as Jake's grip closed around his wrist. Jake gritted his teeth as he pulled the boy up, every muscle in his body straining. Max barked frantically, pacing beside them. "Almost there," Jake muttered, inching the boy to safety. Finally, with one last effort, he pulled him onto solid ground. The child clung to him, sobbing. Max immediately pressed against the boy, licking his face as if to reassure him. Footsteps thundered in the distance, parents breathless and panicked. The moment they saw their son, relief broke over them like a wave. "You saved him," the mother whispered, tears in her eyes. Jake shook his head. Max did. The boy's parents couldn't thank them enough. As they hugged their son tightly, Max sat beside Jake, watching quietly. Jake knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You knew before I did," he murmured. "You saved his life." Max nudged Jake's hand, his warm brown eyes holding an understanding that went beyond words. The past no longer defined Max. He had a new purpose now. Jake felt it deep in his chest. This wasn't just luck, this was fate. That night, the house was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the fireplace. Max lay curled at Jake's feet, his breathing slow and steady. Jake reached down, running a hand through his fur. "We were meant to find each other, weren't we?" Max didn't move, but his paw rested gently on Jake's hand. A silent answer. Jake exhaled, his heart full. They hadn't just rescued each other. They had saved each other's lives in ways neither of them had ever expected. And for the first time in a long time, they were finally home. Max wasn't just another rescue. He was a survivor. A soul battered by life but still standing. And in saving him, Jake unknowingly saved himself. Some beings enter our lives not because we choose them, but because fate insists we need them. Max wasn't just a dog in need, he was a lifesaver in disguise. Trapped beneath the rubble, Max had been left to die, forgotten, abandoned. The weight of his past had nearly crushed him, just as Jake's own burdens had nearly done the same. But sometimes, even when the world turns its back, fate steps in. And fate had chosen Jake to uncover the life hidden beneath the wreckage. The day Jake pulled Max from the wreckage, he thought he was simply doing the right thing, saving a life, giving a second chance. But what he didn't know was that Max had been sent to do the same for him. In the quiet moments, in the unwavering loyalty, in the silent companionship, Max was healing wounds Jake didn't even know he had. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a reckoning, a reminder that sometimes saving another is the only way to save yourself. Max's wounds were visible, scars that spoke of suffering and pain. But Jake's, his were hidden, buried beneath years of loneliness and silent struggles. Each day, as Max's body grew stronger, so did Jake's heart. The companionship, the trust, the understanding, They stitched together the pieces neither of them could fix alone. Their healing wasn't just physical. It was a slow unraveling of past hurts, replaced by something neither had known before: true belonging. Trust is never given freely. It's built, moment by moment, through patience and love. Max had every reason to fear humans, and Jake had every reason to guard his heart. Yet, step by step, they found their way to each other. And in that trust, they discovered something even more powerful: love, the kind that heals what was once broken. As Jake watches Max curled up beside him, breathing peacefully in the quiet night, he finally understands. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog. It was about rewriting a story that had once been filled with pain. The past would always exist, but it no longer defined them. This was a new beginning, not just for Max, but for both of them. Because sometimes the ones we save turn out to be the ones we needed all along.